நேயர்கள் அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். மற்றொரு ஈழத்தமிழரும் சர்வதேச அரசியலும் என்ற இந்த நிகழ்ச்சியூடாக உங்களை சந்திப்பதில் மிக்க மகிழ்ச்சி. இலங்கையில் 2009ஆம் ஆண்டு மே மாதம் யுத்தம் முடிவடைந்ததன் பின்னர் அந்த யுத்தம் ஒரு சாட்சிகளற்ற யுத்தம் என்று கருதப்பட்டது. ஆனால் அதற்கு பின்னர் இலங்கையில் ஜனநாயகத்துக்கான ஊடகவியலாளர் என்ற அமைப்பு, ஜேர்னலிஸ்ட் ஃபார் டெமோக்ரஸி இன் ஸ்ரீலங்கா, இலங்கையில் யுத்த காலத்தின் போது மேற்கொள்ளப்பட்டதாக கூறப்படும் யுத்த குற்றங்கள் தொடர்பிலான ஒரு ஒளிநாடாவை வெளியிட்டிருந்தது. இதனை பிரித்தானியாவின் சேனல் 4 ஊடகம் வெளியிட்டிருந்தது. இதனைத் தொடர்ந்து அங்கு இடம்பெற்ற போர்க்குற்றங்கள், மனிதநேயத்துக்கு எதிரான குற்றங்கள் தொடர்பான சாட்சியங்களும் ஆதாரங்களும் மெல்ல மெல்ல வெளிவர தொடங்கின. இந்த ஆதாரங்கள் வெளிவந்த போது இலங்கை அரசாங்கம் அதனை முற்றாக மறுத்திருந்தது. இந்த ஆதாரங்கள் ஐநா வரை சென்றது. ஆகவே யுத்தத்தில் ஆயிரக்கணக்கான மக்கள் கொல்லப்பட்ட என்ற விடயம் சர்வதேசத்துக்கு ஆதார ரீதியாக முன்வைக்கப்பட்ட போது ஐநாவினுடைய செயலாளர் நாயகம் பேங்கி மூன் அவர்கள் ஒரு விசேட குழுவை அமைத்திருந்தார், விசேட நிபுணர்கள் குழு. அந்த நிபுணர்கள் குழுவிற்கு தருஸ்மான் அவர்கள் தலைவராக நியமிக்கப்பட்டார். அந்த குழுவில் 3 பேர் அடங்கிய குழு. அந்த குழுவிற்கு ஸ்டீபன் ரத்னா மற்றும் யஸ்மின் சூக்கா போன்ற மேலும் சர்வதேச நீதி வல்லுநர்கள் இருவரும் உள்வாங்கப்பட்டிருந்தனர். வெளிவரும் யுத்த குற்றங்கள் தொடர்பான ஆதாரங்கள் உண்மையா, இலங்கையில் அவ்வாறான யுத்தங்கள் உண்மையே யுத்த குற்றங்கள் இடம்பெற்றனவா, சிவிலியன்கள் தமிழ் மக்கள் வேண்டுமென்றே புலிகளை அழிக்கிறோம் என்ற பெயரில் இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்தினால் கொல்லப்பட்டார்களா, இது தொடர்பாக வெளிவரும் ஆதாரங்கள் உண்மையா என்பதனை கண்டறிந்து ஒரு அறிக்கையை தனக்கு சமர்ப்பிக்கும்படி அந்த விசேட நிபுணர்கள் குழுவிடம் ஐநாவினுடைய செயலாளர் நாயகம் பேங்கி மூன் அவர்கள் பணித்திருந்தார். 2010ஆம் ஆண்டு செப்டம்பர் மாதம் ஏறத்தாழ யுத்தம் முடிவடைந்து ஒரு வருடத்தின் பின்னர் இந்த விசேட நிபுணர்கள் குழு அமைக்கப்பட்டது. அதன் பின்னர் 2011ஆம் ஆண்டு மார்ச் மாதம் இந்த 3 அடங்கிய குழு ஒரு அறிக்கையை, மிகவும் காத்திரமான ஒரு அறிக்கையை வெளிக்கொண்டு வந்திருந்தது. இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்தினால் தருஸ்மான் ரிப்போர்ட் என்று அழைக்கப்படும் ஐநாவினுடைய இந்த அறிக்கையின் பிரகாரம் இலங்கையில் பாரிய யுத்த குற்றங்கள், மனித நேயத்துக்கு எதிரான குற்றங்கள் வேண்டுமென்றே திட்டமிட்டு தமிழ் மக்கள் மீது இழைக்கப்பட்டிருக்கிறதாகவும், படையினர் பாரிய அளவில் இந்த யுத்த குற்றங்களை புரிந்திருப்பதாகவும், திட்டமிட்டு வேண்டுமென்றே சிவிலியங்கள் இலக்கு வைக்கப்பட்டிருக்கிறார்கள், மருத்துவமனைகள் குண்டு தாக்குதலுக்கு உள்ளாக்கப்பட்டிருக்கின்றன, கனரக ஆயுதங்கள் சிவிலியங்கள் மீது பாவிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கின்றன, அங்கு நோஃபயர் ஜோன், அதாவது யுத்த சூனிய பிரதேசங்கள் உருவாக்கப்பட்டு மக்களை அங்கு வரவழைக்கப்பட்டு மக்கள் கொத்தாக அங்கு கொல்லப்பட்டிருக்கிறார்கள். இது உண்மையானவை, இது தொடர்பான ஆதாரங்கள் உறுதிப்படுத்தக்கூடியவை என்று அந்த அறிக்கை தெரிவித்திருந்தது. அத்துடன் இது தொடர்பான விசாரணைகள் முறையாக மேற்கொள்ளப்பட்டால் இந்த இந்த குற்றச்சாட்டுகள் உறுதிப்படுத்தப்படுமானால் இலங்கை அரசாங்கம் அல்லது விடுதலை புலிகள் தமது பங்குக்கு விடுதலை புலிகளும் இதில் குற்றங்களை ஈடுபட்டிருக்கிறார்கள் என்றும், குறிப்பாக சிவிலியங்கள் அந்த பிரதேசத்திலிருந்து வெளியேறும் போது அவர்களை வெளிவராக தடுத்தார்கள் என்றும் அந்த அறிக்கையில் தெரிவித்திருந்தது. ஆனாலும் படையினரே பாரிய அளவில் இந்த யுத்த குற்றத்தை புரிந்திருப்பதற்கான சான்றுகள் உறுதிப்படுத்தப்படக்கூடியவையாக இருப்பதாக அந்த அறிக்கை தெரிவித்திருந்தது. அந்த அறிக்கையின் பிரகாரம்தான் பின்னர் இப்போது ஐநா தீர்மானமாக இருந்தாலும் சரி, ஐநா விசாரணையாக இருந்தாலும் சரி, இலங்கை அரசாங்கத்தின் மீது சர்வதேச ரீதியாக கொடுக்கப்படும் அழுத்தங்கள் கூட அந்த அறிக்கையின் அடிப்படையில் தான் வெளிவந்திருந்தன. இன்றைய தினம் இந்த நிகழ்ச்சியில் அந்த 3 அடங்கிய விசேட ஐநா நிபுணர் குழுவின் முக்கிய உறுப்பினரான சர்வதேச சட்ட வல்லுநர் யாஸ்மின் சூக்கா அவர்கள் IBC தமிழுடன் இணைந்து கொண்டிருக்கிறார். அவரை வரவேற்பதில் IBC தமிழ் பெருமை கொள்கிறது. நேரடியாகவே நிகழ்ச்சியில் செல்லலாம். Yasmin Sooka, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
The IBC is feeling very proud to have you here at the show.
It's a pleasure.
You are coming out with in addition to your report on the UN expert panel, you have set up a NGO looking into the post-war torture and other human rights abuses, International Truth and Justice Project on Sri Lanka. Periodically you come out with reports. Today you have come out with another report. What is this report all about?
Well, in the period since 2012 and more recently, the project that I set up with a number of colleagues, a number of very skilled investigators in investigating war crimes, we have documented large numbers of people who have been tortured, raped, sexually violated over the years, and this is after the end of the war. Now, when the government of Sri Lanka announced to the Human Rights Council that they intended to set up a transitional justice program, one of the key elements of transitional justice is that you need to consult with the society, but particularly the victims of violations. And we realized that here in Europe, we were sitting with a number of victims, many of whom have been compelled to leave Sri Lanka because the security forces have made it very difficult for them to remain behind. Many of them are in fact war crimes witnesses, and so they will be really critical to any kind of inquiry that is done on what happened during the war, but also what happened in the post-conflict period. And we decided that a very important contribution we could make would be to consult with these victims, to interview them, and in fact to hear their views and perspectives on the transitional justice program that the government in a joint resolution in the Human Rights Council committed to. So
that was in September last year.
That was in September last year. So in the period between January and more recently, we consulted with more than 76 witnesses. This has been in 4 countries in Europe, lots of witnesses here in the UK, but also people in Switzerland, in Norway, and of course in France. And their views are reflected in this report that we are going to launch. But we have not only reflected what they've had to say about the transitional justice process, but we've also done an analysis of what a transitional justice program should look like in Sri Lanka, because the context in Sri Lanka is very different to other transitional justice programs in the world. The history of transitional justice is said to begin when the Nuremberg trials started and the Tokyo trials. And this is when the Allied forces won the war. And so they were able to put both the Nazi perpetrators and, of course, the perpetrators from Japan on trial. And this was, of course, also followed up by local courts taking on those war crimes. Now, in the period between then and now, what you've had are the Latin American experiences. You've had the experiences in South Africa, in the rest of Africa, and more recently in places like Tunisia. But the difference between what happened in Nuremberg and now is that these have been what you call negotiated processes. So for instance, in Latin America, what you had was the military dictatorships giving up power to civilian rule. But what they did before they gave up their power was they secured blanket amnesties for themselves. Now, in the case of Argentina, of course, the then president of Argentina tried to sue the military to prosecute them, as well as setting up a truth commission. And when he sued the middle-level leadership in the military, what happened was he almost lost power. And he was then compelled to pass 2 laws. In fact, to stop the process of prosecutions. And it has taken Argentina more than 20 years to actually begin to set aside the amnesties and, in fact, to prosecute the perpetrators. And, of course, almost every week in Argentina, you have a new indictment of a former military leader. Now, in the South African instance, what you also had was what we call a negotiated settlement. Nobody won the war. And so at the last moment, just before the interim peace agreement was being signed, one of the things that they negotiated was that there would be an amnesty. But it wouldn't be a blanket amnesty. What they did was they linked the amnesty to the setting up of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And of course, with the South African Truth Commission, what you begin to have is the first body in the world that not only looks at the grant of amnesty, but it also begins to pursue an additional goal. And that is the question of national unity and reconciliation. And since then, of course, you've had this term, a terminology of reconciliation. Now, normally what a transitional justice program does, it looks at the role that former states played in what we call the perpetration of past crimes. And these are what we call war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in some instances, the question of genocide. And what truth commissions do is they look at what were the reasons for these crimes. And what they also look at is what are the antecedents to the conflict. In other words, the question of what are the root causes of the conflict. And usually they have hearings in which victims and perpetrators can come forward and testify. In the South African instance, they named perpetrators. So the names of the perpetrators were in the report. And when the Truth Commission completed its work, it handed over a list of 300 names to the National Prosecutorial Authority in South Africa, so that in fact prosecution should follow. In addition to this, what you normally have is a prosecutorial model. In the South African sense, that was the normal courts and later on special prosecution units. But in the rest of the world, for instance in Sierra Leone, where I also worked, the international community helped the Sierra Leonean government to set up a hybrid court. And that became known as the Special Court of Sierra Leone. And their job was to try those who were the most responsible for the past crimes. In addition to that, you have a reparations program. And reparations are really meant to acknowledge the wrongdoing that was done to victims, acknowledge the crime, and then to look at the harm that they've suffered and the consequences which have followed from that. And of course, in the case of Sri Lanka, you know that not only do people have deep physical problems, but they also have deep psychological trauma, because the way in which this war was conducted has really left severe scars with people. And then finally, the last pillar of what we call transitional justice is called the guarantee of non-recurrence. And the way in which we interpret that is we call that the never, never again. In other words, what does a government need to do to make sure that these crimes can never happen again? And usually that includes what we call institutional reform. It includes security sector reform. And that is really identifying amongst the security forces who were those who were part of the violence and ensuring that in fact either they are put on trial, they are retired, they are taken out of the security forces, and you reformulate how the security forces are supposed to operate. And of course what that also means is constitutional reform. And so you can see that the way in which this clause is structured, it is meant to put in place what we call the foundational bricks to make sure that a state can never go down this route of both impunity and violence again.
So basically this is guaranteeing by the Constitution that this kind of recurrence will not be accepted and those who were responsible will be punished. Basically bringing that kind of laws into the system?
Yes, you do. But remember that punishment can take many different forms. And so we don't only talk about criminal punishment, but we also talk about restorative justice, redistributive justice. In your case, in the Sri Lankan instance, this would involve making sure that people are given their land back. And restorative justice means that in fact you will ensure that in terms of power, that people retain what we call the rights of citizens.
But when in the transitional justice process, when compared to the other parts of the world you mentioned, whether Sierra Leone or Nuremberg, how does it differ when compared to Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka, you have...
At the present context.
In Sri Lanka, of course, you have a very unique situation because for the first time in many decades, you have a country where the government has decisively won the war and it has really destroyed the other side completely. In fact, the LTTE was destroyed completely. And so that places what we call an additional burden on that government, not to exercise what we call victor's justice. Because victor's justice means that you don't put your own people on trial, but you persecute the other group. And in fact, in one of our reports, we talk about the persecution of the war through other means. And those other means have been ongoing abductions, ongoing torture, ongoing sexual violence, but also the complete militarization of the north and east of the country. And in fact, if you look at what the international community has said, that if you want to look at a long-term perspective for Sri Lanka, what you need actually is for the state to acknowledge its own participation in the perpetration of serious crimes. And that means not only looking at what they allege the LTT did, but also looking at what their own security forces did, particularly during the last phase of the war. Now remember, in 2009, after the government won the war, the High Commissioner for Human Rights tried to introduce a resolution in the Human Rights Council, Navanitham Pillai. And in fact, it turned against her, because what countries did is they actually congratulated Sri Lanka for having won the war against terrorists. Now, since 2009, of course, you've had a number of people who've done reports. You've had the Channel 4 documentaries, The Killing Fields. You've had the crisis group release their report on the allegations that war crimes had taken place. Now, this compelled the Secretary General of the United Nations to establish a panel of experts on which I served. And of course, our report was the one which said, yes, there are credible allegations that war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed, and that the bulk of them were committed by the government. And of course, what that resulted in was pressure then on the government to do something about the war crimes. Then, of course, the government set up all these different commissions. The Lessons Learned Commission, you had the Paragama Commission.
Yes.
And of course, what the Lessons Learned Commission did is that they said, this is not our mandate to look at it, but we believe that another body should actually look at this issue. Of course, the other commission tried to whitewash the role of the government. And of course, what the panel of experts did effectively, you will recall that the sort of mythology around at the time in 2009, I remember one of the generals saying to me that I went with the Geneva Convention in one hand, and I was there to mount a humanitarian mission to rescue Tamil civilians. And in fact, there was a 0 civilian casualty in this particular conflict. Well, actually, what we found was very different. And what we said was, in fact, that we believe, given the figures, and remember, we didn't do an exact forensic count, we said that we think that there are around 40,000
yes, that was
civilians.
The first estimation of the UN.
But then, of course, our work was followed up by an internal investigation into the role of the UN during the war. And here, Charles Petrie, who was the key author, said he thinks that figure is close to 70,000. But he also said in the report that from what he had heard from the Bishop of Mannar, that more than 146,000 people were unaccounted for. Now, if one does just a cool math calculation, you look at the number of people who were in the war zone at the beginning, and you look at how many of them came out, and you realize it's quite a big figure that you need to account for. So in my view, you know, I think one of the most fundamental tenets of transitional justice in the form of reparations is that every community has the right to honor its dead and the right to mourn. And so it's really important that whatever transitional structure is set up, it begins to look at this question of what happened to the dead and how many people are dead, so that people can actually say, I know that my loved one is dead. Because you will recall at the end of the war, not only did people surrender people into the custody of the state, but also during the war, as people moved, fleeing from the army, they left the old and those who were dying behind. And so it's really important to begin to establish those kinds of figures.
But since actually we have completed 7 years after the war. still we are unsure of the figures of missing, as well as enforced disappearances, as well as the people who were killed. How are we going to deal with this?
Well, you have a number of bodies in terms of the architecture that the Prime Minister announced to the Human Rights Council. Firstly, you have the Truth Commission. And I think one of the key mandates of the Truth Commission should be to establish this figure of both those people who went missing and those people who were what we call the victims of an enforced disappearance. Then, of course, you also have the Office of the Missing Persons, which the government has just set up this bill. And the problem, of course, with the bill is that the bill refers to missing persons. Now, missing persons can cover a whole variety of categories of people who are no longer there. Whereas when we talk about an enforced disappearance, what we are talking about is an intent on the part of the state to disappear a person. And usually that refers to when somebody has been abducted by the state and has not been acknowledged by the state and accounted for. And that can be either at the hands of the state itself or at the hands of one of its surrogates.
Like the paramilitary groups.
The paramilitary groups.
Yasmin, we have a lot to discuss about this Office of the Missing Person as well as the transitional justice process, the 4 pillars. Before we discuss further, we will go for a short commercial break. Please stay tuned.